So in this section, we are going to learn about cross-sectional study, which is also one of the most important parts in this chapter. So what is cross-sectional study mean? A cross-sectional study examines relationship between disease or other health-related condition and other variable of interest when they exist in a population at a particular time. And one of the most important character of cross-sectional study is that the exposure and the outcome, they exist on the same time. And doing a cross-sectional study is just like a snapshot to capture the characters of the exposure and outcome at the same time. So let's look at the process, the explanation of this cross-sectional study. So as the time goes, we take a described study and we try to collect data at a particular time, and we collect data on both disease and also the exposures, and then we can use the statistical analysis to see if the exposure and the disease were statistically associated. So as I have mentioned before, the onset of study between risk factors and the disease are at the same time. And we try to do cross-sectional study using these routes. First, we define the population, then we gather data on exposure and the disease, and we can see the population can be classified as exposed or not exposed. And we also try to see if the disease prevalence are different between these exposed and the non-exposed groups. And then we can use statistical analysis to see if these differences were with statistically significance in order to determine if the exposure and disease outcomes are associated. So in the real world, we can use this cross-sectional study for many purposes. For example, we can use this cross-sectional study to describe the distribution of health condition and the risk factors in different populations and times. We can also use this study design to measure the association between disease outcomes and the risk factors that could lead to new epidemiologic hypotheses for other study, such as case control or cohort study. We can also to formulate and evaluate the efforts of public health to provide baseline data, and also to conduct surveillance to explore the health status of a country or a specific area. So basically, cross-sectional study can be extensively used in health areas, not only public health. So here are some important characteristics I would like to stress. First, cross-sectional study is one of the most commonly used methods, especially during COVID-19. Because it's very fast, it's rapid and time-saving, so people can do this in a very quick manner. And another important characters of this study is that exposure and the disease state are assessed at the same time, which is different compared to other observational study like case control and cohort study. Individual is unit of observation and analysis. So this characteristics is different to other study in descriptive study, which is a study called ecologic study, which we will mention later on. And the cross-sectional study can typically be descriptive in nature to quantify magnitude of the problem. So this is the important characters of cross-sectional study. And now let's look at the design of the cross-sectional study. In the cross-sectional study, we can use different methods to collect data. We can perform an interview, phone interview, face-to-face interview. We can ask participation by sending a name letter, to calling them, or to do a self-administer questionnaire while online. Or we can do a physical examination or experimental detection to collect some data that we are going to use. And in cross-sectional study, there are major two types. One is called census, another one is called sampling survey. So we were talking about census and the survey in more details in the later slides. The whole design of the cross-sectional study, we can divide them into 7 steps. First is to define the study objectives, and then we can start to select the study populations, the survey to select the survey methods, and to define the variables or study factors. And then we can decide the questionnaire design to collect background data, and finally to do the data analysis. define the study objectives is one of the most important steps, since it will guide the following steps to complete the whole study design. So here is some common or usually used study objectives. For example, to describe the distribution of disease and the risk factors, to provide etiological clues and the general hypothesis for analytic studies, and so on. So we can define the study objectives according to what we are interested in to study. And once we are sure about our study objectives, we can define our study populations and the survey methods. So for the survey method, we need to think about which type of cross-sectional study we are going to use. Is a census study or is a sampling survey? So which type we are going to use, in fact, depends on for example, how much of your research funding is, and also how many manpower is available in your study, and how long you are going to spend on your study, because census study is much more extensive. It's more time consuming, and it will need to include more it will need to include more study populations comparing to sampling survey. So when try to pick up the types of study, we need to think about what we can do, and which method is the most appropriate for our purpose. And then we can try to select the variables or factors that we are going to study. And remember, we can correct both exposures and outcomes at the same time. For the exposures, which also can be called as risk factors. For example, the sex, age, nation, age, occupation, education, income, and so on. For the disease outcome, we can collect any outcomes that we are interested in. For example, we can collect data about disease occurrence, also the progression of disease or the death. Next step is to design a proper questionnaire that we can use in a cross-sectional study in order to collect all the data that we're going to use. So there are some important principles should be followed. So let's briefly look at these principles. For example, the survey should include most relevant questions and exclude those not really relevant items. And the number of items should be simplified, and the question should be expressed in detail, clearly. And those very complicated terminology should be avoided. Try to use those common words that ordinary people can easily understand. Particularly, the answer items should include all possible elements. And next principle is trying to use objective measures as much as possible. So, for example, you want to investigate the smoking habit of a person, and you want to know how severe smoking habit he is. So you can ask how many cigarettes per day you use, instead of like how severe you smoking habits. So try to use those objective measures as much as possible. And there are also some management that we can use. For example, those questions in the beginning should be easy to reply. So we usually put the like very simple question in the front. So those very easy questions, such as like how are you, what's your name, how old are you, what's your gender, what's your height and weight. So this is a small tick that to start with, because then people will happy to answer your questionnaires. Otherwise, for them it's very hard to continue if the beginning questions are already very difficult to answer. And another principle is that should be remembered that open questions are very difficult to code. So we usually avoid those open questions, and instead we use those questions with options as much as possible. So if you look at the books on page 33, here is an example of questionnaire for diabetes survey. So this survey including, for example, like general information to start with. So it's very easy to begin with the questionnaire, and also the history of disease, and also the physical examinations. Of course, the physical examinations was measured by the investigators, professional investigators. And the next step of designing cross-sectional study could be collect background data. So when we talk about collect background data here, you need to know more about this research area. You need to familiar with the standard diagnosis of the disease and the standard measurement methods that can be used for exposure. For example, how you define a smoker, regular smoker. We usually define a regular smoker if he or she have been smoking for half years and at least everyday habits, so he or she smoke every day for at least half a year. And the final step in the design of cross-sectional study is the data analysis. So in this step, we usually can describe the baseline demographic characteristics in order to show the baseline distributions of the gender, age, occupation, marriage status, and their socioeconomic status. And we also can report the disease distribution in the entire population or by different groups, for example, that different age group, different gender group, and so on. And the final data analysis is try to analyze the association between the exposure and the disease that we are studying. So we can use the statistical method to determine the potential association between exposure and the disease. So during the design of the survey, we cannot avoid errors in such observational study. So we will need some quality control. So here are some tips that we can learn about how to perform a quality control. The first one is the sample selection should be randomized. So which means that the sample that we collect should be representative for the whole entire populations. And a pilot survey will be better to design and perform. So a pilot survey will help us to understand if our survey design or the questionnaire design or the methodology design is appropriate to use in this study. And this usually is also very important to evaluate the validity of our questionnaire. So we can evaluate our questionnaire validity in a pilot survey. Another very important issue is that the response rates. Usually, the response rate should be higher than 80 to 90%. So if we have lower response rate, for example, if we have only 50% response rate, that might cause selection bias. And as we need to use many investigators during the data collections, it's very important to train them in a uniform manner. So every study participants, they can be interviewed in a similar way. So in order to reduce the information bias. And the methods of survey and examination should be standardized and specialized. And another issue I want to mention here is we need to do a data audit. So sometimes when we enter all the data that we collected into our database, there can be some errors occurs during these data enterings. So usually we can randomly select, let me say, 5% of data to perform a data audit to make sure the data we enter were correct.